Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hatfield campus of the University of Pretoria. My name is Maxis Skuman. I'm from the Department of Political Sciences, and I'm also on the advisory board of our Center for Mediation. I want to welcome in particular the following people. Our guest speaker, Mr. Saleh Hijazi, from Amnesty International. We're very pleased that you're here in person. Welcome to Pretoria. Our two panelists, former Minister Ronnie Kasrils and Mr. Zane Dangor from DIRCO. You're very welcome. I also want to say a word of welcome to our moderator for this event, Ms. Zeenat Adam. I'll introduce her in a moment. Thank you so much for availing yourself to participate in this afternoon's discussion on Amnesty International's report on Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. You will have received a copy of the report. It was released earlier this month. I also welcome those ambassadors and members of the diplomatic community who have joined us, particularly the attaché from the Palestinian embassy, as well as colleagues from the University of Pretoria and our neighboring universities. Very importantly, our students. I'm so pleased to see so many of our students here because these events are actually organized for our students, and that is important. I would also like to acknowledge our Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice Principal Academic, Professor Norman Duncan, who was instrumental in getting this afternoon organized. Professor Duncan, thank you very much. I know you will have to leave for a faculty board meeting in a moment, the joys of being an academic. For us in the Department of Political Sciences and its Center for Mediation, this afternoon's seminar is of particular importance. It is the first seminar that we conduct in 2 years on this campus. I mean, in terms of having people here in person. It is a pity that COVID protocols limit our number of in-person attendees to only 50 people, but at the very least, we are slowly returning to some semblance of normality and resuming a normal academic and public program again at the university. I'm also very pleased that we can live stream this event, so we are reaching quite a wide audience. We are pleased and privileged to collaborate on this event with DIRCO and with the Afro-Middle East Centre. Thank you. Secondly, this event speaks directly to what our university is about. It is a place where we share, exchange, and interrogate ideas, and where we exercise our public role of providing a platform for the discussion of what is sometimes considered to be rather controversial and contentious issues and topics. I am pleased that we managed to bring together researchers, thinkers, activists, policymakers, and students to discuss what is certainly an important report on one of the most intractable problems of the past more than 75 years. Questions about belonging and who makes decisions and who benefits are at the core of our academic inquiry. And it is fitting that we, as the University of Pretoria, co-host this event. Issues of human rights and human dignity are at the forefront of the university's research focus areas. And these speak not only to our country or our continent, but our concerns are also international and global. I therefore congratulate the Center for Mediation for organizing this afternoon's event, together with AMEC and DIRCO. I want to thank our head of department, Professor Victoria Graham, Professor Corrie Willinga, and also Dr. Qureisha Suleiman, and in particular, Ms. Kirsty Nepnocheno, for their hard work in putting it all together under great pressure of time. A big thank you, as I've said, to our DVC, Professor Norman Duncan, for his support, not only regarding this event, but over many years of our center's existence. Allow me also to thank the technical teams from Audio Torch and Kwebong Consulting, and of course, Salam Media for live streaming the event. I now leave you in the very capable hands of Ms. Zeenat Adam, who will introduce the speakers and moderate this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Skuman.
Thanks.
Good afternoon to all of our distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, and members of the diplomatic corps, to the professors and academics of University of Pretoria, and of course to the students who are joining us today. We welcome you to this event, and as Professor Skuman has said, this is the first time that we're able to host an event of this nature since the COVID lockdowns. We're very honored that Amnesty International has arranged for Mr. Saleh Hijazi to be in South Africa for the South Africa launch of this important and explosive report. Mr. Hijazi is Amnesty International's head of office in Jerusalem. He's a human rights activist and researcher. And prior to Amnesty, he worked at Human Rights Watch and Al-Quds University, Human Rights Clinic in the occupied Palestinian territories. He holds a BA in philosophy and an MA in human rights. We are also joined on the panel by former Minister Ronnie Kasrils. I think he needs no introduction, but is a stalwart of our struggle and in anti-apartheid, and he has been an absolute committed person to the BDS and Palestinian movement. We are also joined by the advisor to the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Mr. Zane Dangor, who previously served as the Director General for Social Development and has been very influential in bringing together Palestinian NGOs and in working with them. We hope that this is going to be a very interactive panel, and we want to have a lot of questions coming from the floor. We will first hear from Saleh and then move on to Zane and then to Minister Kasrils. I would ask that the speakers keep their interventions a little bit short so that we have time for interventions from the floor. And I would also want to request that we look at a little bit of the history between what South Africa experienced during apartheid and what Palestinians are experiencing under apartheid, noting that the architects of the Balfour Declaration included Jan Smuts, who then came and implemented apartheid in South Africa. He's a great supporter of the Zionist movement, and I think that this is something that we need to remember moving forward. Saleh, I would like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. A great honor and pleasure to be among you and speaking to you today. Really looking forward also to the discussion after the interventions. Yesterday, 23rd of February 2022, 13-year-old Muhammad Rizq Salah was killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. He is the second child to be killed by Israeli forces since the beginning of 2022. Last year, Israeli forces killed 76 Palestinian children. The day before Muhammad was killed, Israeli authorities demolished homes of Palestinians in Al-Araqib village in the Naqab Negev desert, southern Israel, for the 198th time. 2,568 structures, living and residential structures, were demolished by Israeli forces in the Naqab Negev in 2020. More than 150,000 Palestinians currently are under the threat of losing their homes, either through home demolitions or forced evictions. Earlier this month, on 7th of February, the Israeli Knesset Parliament approved in first reading a law that prevents Palestinians married to Palestinian citizens or residents of Israel from living with their families in Israel or the occupied East Jerusalem. This law, which was a temporary law from 2003 until 2021, continues a long-standing policy of separating Palestinian families, affecting thousands of Palestinians. Earlier this year, in January, Amal Nakhli turned 18 in administrative detention. Administrative detention is detention without charge or trial. He has been held since January 2021. He suffers from a neuromuscular disorder. An average of 2 Palestinian children are held in administrative detention each month. Same month, January, on the 12th of January, 80-year-old Omar Asad was found dead with his hand cut in his village of Jaljilia in the occupied West Bank after he was detained by Israeli forces raiding his village. These are just some of the human rights violations perpetrated by Israeli authorities against Palestinians since the beginning of the year. What they have in common is that one, happened this year, 2, they expressed cruelty, and they were carried out with impunity. But what is more important is that they are all symptoms of something structural and deeply rooted. That is Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, cruel system of domination, and a crime against humanity. This is the title of Amnesty International's report. It's a 208-page report published this month. This is just the executive summary. Based on over 20 years of documentation and in-depth analysis, legal analysis of Israel's laws, policies, and practices against Palestinians, the report finds that Israel is imposing a system of oppression and domination amounting to apartheid, and perpetrating the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians in Israel and occupied Palestinian territories, and with effect on Palestinian refugees living outside of this territory. The report illustrates how this system is made up of 4 main pillars. 1, it is the fragmentation of Palestinian society. It is the separation of Palestinian communities into what we know now as the domains of control. Gaza Strip, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, and the Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem, and of course Palestinian refugees living still in refugee camps, or majority of whom living in refugee camps around the country. Fragmentation is the first pillar. 2, it's a segregation and control within the areas that Israel controls. It is the keeping of Palestinians in restricted areas, specific restricted areas, and controlling them very often violently, like in the case of Gaza Strip, for example, where Israel imposes an illegal blockade that amounts to collective punishment. 3 is the dispossession of land and property. It is the body of laws and policies that Israel has put in place to take away property, particularly land, from Palestinians in a discriminatory manner and not allow them access to this land. And 3 is the deprivation of rights, particularly intentional deprivation of rights, social and economic rights. The report also documents the intent behind this system, as expressed in the laws, policies, and practices, but also through the statements of Israeli officials since the establishment of the state in 1948 and until our time today. This intent is to ensure domination of one racial group over another. In this case, it is the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. It is to have Jewish Israeli hegemony, both in terms of demography and geography, meaning to have Jewish Israelis as the majority of the population, and with these majority to have maximum control over land. The report also documents how Israel perpetrates inhuman acts as defined under international law to maintain this system of oppression and domination. These include forcible transfers. Under forcible transfers are home demolitions, forced evictions, and the creation of coercive environments to push Palestinians out of areas that Israel controls, basically to decrease the number of Palestinians there. 2, it's the use of arbitrary detention and torture, including, for example, the use of administrative detention. You mentioned the case of Amal Nakhli, but also torture, which is sanctioned by law in Israel. 3 is the use of unlawful killings. And 4, it's the persecution or the denial of basic rights. These acts form a widespread and systematic attack against the Palestinian population and are what make up then the crime against humanity of apartheid perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians. Let me say a bit about the system and the research methodology behind the report. I pointed to it using over 20 years of Amnesty's documentation. The report includes over 30 case studies, the majority of which Amnesty has documented, reported, and campaigned on for more than 20 years. We've also carried out extensive legal analysis of this documentation in the framework of apartheid as defined in international law, both in the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, but also the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But most importantly, the report, based on the definition of apartheid, looks at how one group of people is dominating another. The view is taken on how, it's a people's view rather than a geographic view of apartheid. And we arrive at the conclusion that apartheid is both a system, a violation of public international law, amounting to grave human rights violation, and a crime against humanity, according to customary international law, particularly international criminal law, is perpetrated by Israel against Palestinians wherever they control their rights. And to understand this system, we needed to go look at the roots of the system. And therefore, we looked at how the body of laws, policies, and practices were put in place at the time of Israel's establishment and soon after. The initial act of fragmentation was the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians through massacres and forced displacement around the time of the establishment of the state, pushing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians outside of what became Israel and not allowing them the right to return. Segregation and control is then when Palestinians who became citizens of Israel, but never equal to Jewish Israelis because of a body of laws that differentiate between nationals on one hand and citizens. So in Israel, you have a situation where every national is a citizen, but not every citizen is a national. Nationals are only Jews, while citizens can be also others like Palestinians. Following the establishment of the state in 1948, Israel imposed a military rule over Palestinians, segregating them into their communities, enforcing closures on them, and not allowing them basic rights, including the right to freedom of movement. And then there was the body of laws that were put in place to dispossess Palestinians, those who remained and those who left, of their properties, particularly land. And the most notable law is the absentee property law, which allowed Israel then to confiscate properties of Palestinian refugees, but also those who remained inside of Israel, and move it to state control, the Israel Land Authority. And the deprivation then of basic rights, including economic and social rights. With this, it goes hand in hand with the imposition of the military regime on Palestinians, including not allowing Palestinians freedom of movement so that they can go work or, for example, access their agricultural lands. So the system is deeply rooted, it still exists today, and it's a crime against humanity. This is what the report is about in 280 pages, which I also mentioned a bit about the methodology behind. But what is important about our report, Amnesty's report now? One, that it does provide extensive documentation and analysis of the system and the crime of apartheid that Israel imposes on Palestinians. But Amnesty is not the first to do this. Palestinian rights advocates have been doing this for many decades. They have actually started, they pioneered the use of the legal analysis, apartheid's legal analysis, and the narrative to describe the situation that exists in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. After Palestinians, we've seen over the last few years, or actually a couple of years, that Israeli groups, namely B'Tselem and Yashdin, have followed suit and also published position papers making the case that Israel is perpetrating the crime against humanity against Palestinians, then followed by international groups, most notably Human Rights Watch last year, and then Amnesty. And with the publication of this report from Amnesty, we have completed a consensus among the international human rights movement working on human rights in Israel and Palestine, and the consensus that Israel is imposing a system of apartheid and is perpetrating the crime against humanity of apartheid against Palestinians. Also very important that this report comes as a response to Palestinian action on the ground to defy Israel's system of oppression and domination and resist against it. Last year, very significantly, Palestinians across the Green Line, meaning in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, have held an act of civil disobedience and went on strike, perhaps unprecedented since 1930s, that Palestinians act in a way to defy fragmentation and stand all together against the system of oppression and domination. This continues, and it's not new. In 2018, Palestinians in Gaza, most of whom are refugees, have held what was called the Great March of Return, where they organized weekly protests along the line that separates Gaza from Israel to call on lifting of the illegal blockade and the collective punishment, and for them as refugees to return to their homes they were forcibly displaced from in 1948. Before that, there are many actions, and reminder of also 2011, where Palestinian refugees in Syria and Lebanon marched onto the border, also demanding their right of return. Palestinians are continuously practicing their agency, they're continuously resisting, and this report can be seen as one of the responses by the international community to this action. And the consensus is very important. And now that this consensus and the support for Palestinians must be widened, and countries must now also live up to their moral and legal responsibility to dismantle Israel's apartheid against Palestinians and bring those responsible to justice. The report includes more than 7 pages of recommendations, including to governments around the world, to the UN and UN bodies like UN Security Council, asking for a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel and asking for targeted sanctions on Israeli individuals and officials who are complicit in the crime of apartheid. And there are also recommendations to businesses and humanitarian organizations and others. Those recommendations provide for a solid basis for bringing the system down. More will need to be done, but they are a solid basis for what Amnesty believes is a solid basis for bringing the system down and putting an end to the crime against humanity. But it all starts from a very important premise, and that is recognition. Recognizing the situation for what it is in Israel and Palestine. And that is apartheid, a cruel system of domination and a crime against humanity. Apartheid should have no place in our world today, and so therefore with this, and given the launch of the report in South Africa, I'm asking everybody here today and everybody watching to join us, Amnesty International, our partners, and most importantly, Palestinians on the ground, to put an end to Israel's apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saleh. I think that you've really touched our hearts by giving some of the personal stories of the Palestinians who are suffering at the hands of the apartheid regime. For me, what stands out is in May last year, the arrests of the young women in Sheikh Jarrah and the smiles on their faces as they were being taken away by the Israeli forces. I remember Razan at the Great March of Return, killed as a paramedic trying to treat some of the Palestinians who were injured and who are deliberately maimed and crippled by the Israeli government. But what I want to move on to now is to ask Zane Dangor, the advisor of Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, to guide us through what South Africa's response to the report is and what South Africa's plan is going forward. We have seen some beautiful and illustrious statements by South Africa on the international stage and at the African Union, but we want to see more action. Zane, could you please enlighten us? Thank you.
Thank you, Zeenat, and perhaps I'll also talk about the actions of many other states. The ambassadors are sitting here with us. But firstly, I think it's an honor to be on this panel with Saleh and Minister Kasrils, former Minister Kasrils. And it's fitting that he will conclude this discussion from the panel. So as a government, we welcome the Amnesty International report. And I'm not going to go into the details of it. I think Saleh has done a really good job of just highlighting some of the key issues that made them come to the conclusion that the crime of apartheid was being committed. But we need to point out that this report complements, and Saleh spoke about this as well, many other reports over the last few decades. And, reports by Al-Haq and 7 other Palestinian NGOs have been saying this for quite a while. We've also had a very good book, and it should be required reading for all. It's a book by Ilan Pape, somebody called Ronnie Kasrils, and Dr. Oran Pandor, which was entitled Israel and Apartheid, the many faces of apartheid. That book too outlined the similarities between the oppression of Palestinians under Israeli occupation and how it approximates an apartheid system. Then importantly, and I think we need to mention this, the Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem. And what is useful about the B'Tselem report and this report is that both reports talk about an apartheid system that is widespread and systemic. And it talks about an apartheid system on both sides of the Green Line, so throughout historical Palestine. Human Rights Watch report talks about the occupied territories, and then we'll also have another report being presented by the current Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, Michael Link, at the Human Rights Council, which will also focus on the occupied territories only. So the Amnesty report and the B'Tselem report is groundbreaking that it includes refugees, it includes Palestinians living in what is regarded as Israel proper, and also the occupied territories, and the widespread nature and systemic nature of the apartheid that they analyze. So all of these reports make a compelling case that the situation in Palestine is in breach of the Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And I need to point out that the South African cabinet has agreed to the ratification of this convention. It's 25 years late, but we've agreed to the ratification and it's waiting for its passage through Parliament. And it's one of those that we should have ratified right at the beginning, immediately after our elections, but we didn't. And we made sure that this happens now. But I want to just talk about what this means, because what this means, if we take these reports from civil society, and it's reputable civil society organizations, reputable international legal scholars, the work has been thoroughly researched, it's well documented, the specific acts and actions and policies are well documented in all of these reports, begins to point that there is indeed a breach of the Suppression of Apartheid Act, the Apartheid Convention. What it means for South Africa and other states is that there is now a need to shift from political solidarity towards legal duty, and legal duty under international law. I'm not going to go into the crime of apartheid and what it means, but there is prohibitions against the crime of apartheid with concomitant actions that is expected by other states. So Saleh spoke about the convention, the ICC, which is basically, the ICC just took the Suppression Convention and put it into its jurisdiction. But there's also other international treaties, including Article 55 and 56 of the UN Charter that we should bear in mind, which is also binding. But importantly is that the prohibition of apartheid is also the most recent report of the International Law Commission as being a norm of a Jus Cogens norm. So there is then a duty on states to ensure that we, all of us as states, do not condone situations that arise from these breaches, whether it's increased settlements, whether it's any of the laws that Saleh has just spoken about. There's also a duty on us to act against what is called international wrongful acts, which is also mentioned by the International Law Commission. And this is the issues that the South African government is going to be concerned with in terms of what actions we should take. But also, South Africa alone cannot do this. And this is where this discussion is so important. Politics is nebulous. It can shift with changes of leadership in governments, but the international legal framework should guide any government that respects international law to ensure that when there are serious breaches of international law and breaches of the Apartheid Convention and other international treaties where racism and apartheid is prohibited, that state action is taken. And I think this is where South Africa would want to engage within the international community, using what has been coming from civil society and moving it into state action. So we should be moving towards a decision at the United Nations to resuscitate, for example, the kinds of committees on apartheid. We have the Committee on Palestine, but it's different. But the Committee on Apartheid, which doesn't just focus on Palestine, but focuses on other situations where the crime of apartheid may be breached. So this is one of the issues that we will be taking forward. We will be having to engage with other states, because to get this through, one needs a resolution, a simple majority at the General Assembly, but we may also need to consider, is the evidence emerging from these reports enough for states to take action? We think it is. We think that the evidence is enough for a resolution at the GA that begins to deal with the government of Israel in the same way that the GA dealt with the apartheid government, and many of the same sanctions that emerge from that. But if that's not enough, you might find some states arguing that we need a sort of an international legal body to confirm what Saleh has said, or what Michael Sfard from Yeshdin has said. And perhaps we are considering, and we're looking at the pros and cons of this, whether we should be asking the General Assembly to refer this to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. An advisory opinion that is guided by the body of work that's been done by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. It doesn't have to do its own research. We feel that the research has been done. They should evaluate the data and the evidence and give us an advisory opinion, so that guidance is given to states through an appropriate international regulatory body. I'm going to conclude on the South African government itself will be assessing these reports and looking at what we need to do now. And what we need to do now would then be done in concert with mobilizing within the African Union, mobilizing within the broader international community, because the jurisprudence on the crime of apartheid arises from the South African and Namibian situations. The crime of apartheid obviously emerged from what happened here and the analysis that what happened here. The jurisprudence on the crimes of occupation, much of it comes from South Africa's occupation of Namibia, which was illegal. So South Africa and Namibia we convened a meeting on the margins of the General Assembly last year. It was online, where we had Human Rights Watch speak on their report on the crime of apartheid. We had Michael Sfard speak on his legal opinion for Yeshdin. So we've started the ball rolling on this dialogue on what do we need to do as a state and as a community of states against a state that is obviously in breach of the Apartheid Convention. I want to conclude, the question that we should all ask ourselves as state is what is our responsibilities as states and the wider international community towards a state that is not adhering to international norms? Is it going to be business as usual, or are we going to take the evidence emerging from these reports to change the manner in which we engage at the UN? And I'm looking at my colleagues from the from the international community, including some of the frontline states around Palestine, for some reaction on what they may want to do with us on this issue. Thanks, Zeenat.
Thank you very much, Zane. I hear you on the issues of trying to raise this to the point of the United Nations, but let's be honest. We've had several United Nations General Assembly resolutions that have gone unadhered to by the Israelis, and we haven't really had much action from the United Nations. And of course, when you have the veto power at the Security Council of Israel's strongest ally, we're not really convinced that this is going to make a difference. So we really are hopeful that this report will be taken forward, but in all honesty, I'm not sure. Minister Kasrils, perhaps you can reflect and give us some insight on how South Africa won the fight against apartheid and whether or not we are on that road for the Palestinians as well. Thank you.
Sanibunani, Dumelang, Salam Alaikum, and thank you very much to Pretoria University and their co-hosts for arranging this very useful and important meeting here. It's very good to see the turnout from Diplomatic Corps. One notes, of course, that it's basically from Africa and the Middle East. It's not surprising that most of the Western countries, as they will be doing in relation to the Amnesty report, striving to ignore what is so important and justified. And let me say immediately that we wholeheartedly welcome this Amnesty report. It's an absolutely outstanding, significant milestone of a document of great importance internationally and to us here in South Africa. One is immediately struck by the similarities. And dear brother Saleh from Jerusalem, which is facing such problems in terms of its integrity and its Muslim and Arab basis in relation to an onslaught. And if anybody needs, by the way, to ask, is Israel an apartheid state? Well, all we need to do is look at the law they have passed just a few years ago, and that is Israel is a Jewish state and a state of the Jewish people, ignoring the 20% of people who are Palestinian. It would be like South Africa, as it did in apartheid days, ignoring the fact that anybody who was not pure Aryan, Caucasian white was not a citizen of South Africa. And I say this to the lovely young students of this university, and so many of whom who have turned out today who are indigenous to this country. Understand what happens in the past to the people of this country under white supremacy, under apartheid, and what the Palestinian people are facing, which is so outstandingly, absolutely outstandingly represented, presented through the documentation that, Zane, you have referred to in such a professional manner in relation to Israel as an apartheid state. And of course, we've had reference to the fact that this is not new. It's welcomed that of international human rights organizations, that perhaps the most prestigious of all, Amnesty International, has actually rounded the circle, because virtually all of the serious international human rights organizations and associations, along with many countries, including South Africa, and of course the international BDS, Palestinian Solidarity Movements, and South Africans, many South Africans who have said Israel is an apartheid state. This book proves it absolutely uncontrovertibly, and people need to study it. One of the key points, Saleh, and to those, the Amnesty International representative here in South Africa, we have to distribute this far and wide, and I would say we must translate this into our indigenous languages, because the battle for Africa, for our people, and I say this to our students here, to understand that the crimes, the sins of Zionism vested on the Palestinian people whose land and rights have been dispossessed parallels what has happened in South Africa. Many South Africans have said that Israel is an apartheid state, and many have said that what is happening to the Palestinian people is far worse than we underwent in South Africa. And I refer to former President Kgalema Motlanthe, to many others, Frank Chikane of the Christian Institute and so on, Desmond Tutu, who in 1989, on his visit to the occupied territories, said that what they are suffering is akin to what the black people of South Africa have suffered on. There's a South African who back in 1961, not long after the Sharpeville massacre, and we've seen the massacres of Palestinians over and over again, including children and women who have been referred to, a South African who said in that year, Israel is an apartheid state. The irony is it was the architect of South African apartheid, the late unlamented Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. Why did he say this? Back in those days, Saleh, in case you're not aware, he said it because the world was condemning apartheid after the Sharpeville massacre, where people were protesting for their rights, as do the Palestinians in the Intifada and so on, against house demolitions, etc. And Verwoerd was aggrieved that Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, had come here to lecture him and the Parliament, the all-white Parliament in Cape Town, and said, you must recognize the winds of change coming to Africa, the anti-colonial struggles. And of course, Israel is a racist colonial state, settlement state. And Israel at that time, striving hypocritically to present itself to the world as anti-racist. The mask has long slipped. It's one of the most racist states in the world, and racist in the apartheid sense of legislation and law which undermines Israel. It's not just prejudice and xenophobia of racist kind, which unfortunately we find throughout the world, but it's reinforced by legislation, by law, by the law of return for Israelis, keeping refugees away, and the passing of the law of Israel is the state of the Jewish people and not the citizens who live there. And he was aggrieved. And what this crazy racist said was, how dare they complain? Israel, after all, is an apartheid state. They've taken the land from the Arab people over 800 years ago. Of course, he was ignorant of the fact that actually Palestinians have lived there from time immemorial, and he was just thinking of Arabs in the Islamic phase after Muhammad had come to rule. So it goes back. And let me add to those who will say that your report is anti-Semitic. One of the first, of course, the Palestinians, back from 1947-48, were talking about the racism, the domination, what Zionism was about. But Israelis, Jews in historic Palestine, from 1983-85, Yuri Davis, who visited this country, he calls himself a Palestinian Jew, and he decides to live in Ramallah. And he issued a book in 1985, people, which said Israel is an apartheid state. We all know of the outstanding work of Ilan Pappé, in which he condemns, but he shows, as this book does, through research and documentation, that Israel, that Zionism, had prepared a whole plan over the years, from the time of Herzl, to rid the Holy Land of the Palestinian people. and to replace them with Jewish settlement. So the book squares the circle. It comes round. What is important, and I'll come a little more to the South African experience in terms of what you've requested, but I must say this, why it's so outstanding and why it actually gels with what we in South Africa have been saying, and others, including scholars, Arab, Palestinian, African, South African scholars have been saying, Jews and otherwise. The great Edward Said, of course, is that it's not just what Jimmy Carter said some years ago in his book, that Israel is apartheid in terms of the occupied territories, where, as we know, they're illegal settlements, they get all the water, they can deal with absolute violence, and these are the illegal settlers against the Palestinians. They steal their land, they steal the water, and so on. But, and of course, they create Jewish-only roads, which Palestinians can't use. So Carter said, that's an apartheid state, that's apartheid in the occupied areas. And we know this particular aspect of Gaza, which to all purposes is a beleaguered city area by Israel in the cruelest form. But this book and the scholars I've referred to talk about Israeli apartheid, not just in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, or East Jerusalem, which is being Judified in the cruelest way of house demolitions and ejection of people to create a Jewish majority, which was the apartheid approach in South Africa on the Democratic Front. But that apartheid relates to those Palestinians living within what is referred to as Israel. Israel itself, where you have 20% of the population are Palestinians. That it is apartheid, it's racial discrimination through legislation, through practice, through the law and force within Israel itself. Further is the fact, and so important, that it's not only people, and it's 6 million equivalent to the Jews of historic Palestine, 6 million Palestinians, equivalent to the 5-6 million Jews of historic Palestine. It is the millions now, 7 millions, maybe more, of Palestinians, descendants and those who were ejected themselves, like your family and families before yours, from 1948. That this apartheid goes back to 1948, and that the refugees who were expelled are the victims, and they live in the neighboring states, and they live in a diaspora across the world. That is what we're referring to as the victims of Israeli apartheid. Those in our country who know and have lived through, or who are descendants, the born frees, post-1994 in our democracy, fought for in the same way as the Palestinian Intifada. People fighting for their land rights, which were dispossessed, for their human rights, of which were stripped, as in 1948, Israel and its occupation. Know all about what is occurring when they see the truth and these facts in terms of land dispossession in South Africa, the fact that the people, indigenous people, were stripped of all their rights, were discriminated against in the cruelest form, where we had laws passed, such as the pass laws, to control their movements in the severest way, when we see the control of Palestinian people in the occupied areas. The Group Areas Act, which in the demographic sense and for that purpose, removed black people, including also Indian and mixed race people from white areas, and moved them out far from the towns where they were controlled by the past laws. And those who weren't working or needed in the economic zones of white South Africa were pushed to the Bantustans, areas like the occupied Palestinian territories, or where the refugees are, far away and without citizenship rights. The Bantustan projects in South Africa was the exact similarity. I'm not saying 100%, there are differences. The report concludes that. We've always said it's not a mirror image, but the essence is the same. And the Bantustans were to strip the indigenous people of their citizenship and equality in South Africa. The Bantu Education Act was to consign the African people, the young people of Africa, before those of you who attend this university, into an oblivion, to simply be trained to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. Speaking of which, and just to reinforce, I've been a water minister in this country. The laws, the measures against people in Gaza and the West Bank in relation to the privileges that the illegal settlers in the West Bank have to the consumption of water at the expense of the 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank is itself an absolute crime against humanity. So I could go on, and I'm really wishing to remind our South Africans and our black students here who must know and understand the information that's being provided. Because here in South Africa, as in Africa, and I say this to the African diplomats present, the Zionists supported essentially by the Western powers, and particularly the United States, who, as we know, provides billions of aid to Israel in order that Israel can carry out a specific role in terms of domination of the Middle East, which is so strategic, and we can go on about oil resources, etc. That the USA, the UK, the European Union are the ones who are providing Israel with a kind of impunity that the Western powers, from Germany and France to the USA and Britain in particular, provided to the apartheid regime in South Africa. And it was the African states in particular, and we say this to the Arab states, who ought to be providing the fullest support to the Palestinian people, not reneging on them as they are now. That it's the struggle of the people, as in South Africa primarily, with the support of an international community that brought about the end of apartheid in South Africa, and can be the same in relation to the future in Palestine, where it should be a state really of all its people without the discrimination, the kind of unitary state and freedoms we have in South Africa. That's my input. Thank you very much for listening. I just need to add that the way in which the people of the world and we in South Africa can support the Palestinian people goes further than this report, which correctly calls for an arms embargo on Israel. But it needs to go much further. And those are three little words which helped South Africa immensely: boycott, divestment, sanctions against an apartheid regime. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Minister Kasrils, for giving us such a powerful input on the issues of what Palestinians are facing, but also what can be done from a South African perspective. I think when we look at the situation in Palestine, we can acknowledge that 1948 was the Nakba, but that hasn't ended. We're still watching the dispossession and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their land. And when you talk about the Group Areas Act, Minister, I still live in an area where my family was dispossessed of their land and moved outside of the city. And for us, when we look at somebody like Muna Al-Kurd or Muhammad Al-Kurd, who are standing in Sheikh Jarrah and saying, Lan narhal, we will not leave, it's reminiscent of what many families in South Africa did and experienced in the 70s when the Group Areas Act was introduced in South Africa. With that, I want to begin to open the floor. We will give 3 questions at a time. There is a roving mic. Please raise your hands, introduce yourself and your organization, and then we will defer to the panel after the 3 questions and then open for another round. May I have a show of hands? I have Jacqueline Kutsia here. I have a hand at the back, and I have one on this side in the white t-shirt. Genevieve, if we can start there.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Kutzer, independent researcher and supporter of the Palestinian cause. There is one issue that was briefly touched on in the report, but that I think that a lot of people in South Africa and maybe around the world are not aware of. Most people think that apartheid in South Africa only came about in 1948 or so when the when the Nationalist Party came to power. But in actual fact, what happened was South Africa was a British colony. And Britain, as part of its policy of divide and conquer, came up with this whole policy of apartheid, which even started in 1910 and even before that. And if you look at the Palestinian situation, it's the same. Palestine was a British mandate, and the British started with their whole divide and conquer policies even before the state of Palestine was created. When we finally take Israel to the ICJ, and in the same way that was done to South Africa, should we not also take the United Kingdom, Britain itself, to the ICJ as the creator of apartheid in South Africa and in Palestine? They have to take responsibility for how they have tried to divide and conquer people and impose their racist policy and impose their apartheid on our governments and our people, and the bloodshed that they caused to millions of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Genevieve, if we can get the mic towards the back, please. And while that's happening, I think that Minister Kasrils also referred to the BDS movement and the sanctions that need to happen, but he also spoke about the military-industrial complex that is Israel. And I think that we also need to reflect on how Israel is beginning to export their surveillance capitalism into the rest of the continent and into other parts of the world where essentially apartheid is being implemented in fascist states. Thank you to the speaker there.
Greetings to the honorable ambassadors, panelists. My name is Mudassir Ali Sayed, and I'm the current chairperson of the Muslim Student Association, as well as the Deputy General Secretary of the PSC. I would like to actually pose a question to the panelists. How do us, as young advocates of the Palestinian plight, believe that this document is going to end up ending this humanitarian crisis? How do we not just put it forth that this is going to be a document that is going to land up on a shelf and just be memorized or just be looked into and contributed to the stack of papers and files that are already documenting the apartheid that Israel is imposing on the Palestinian people? Thank you.
We had a hand on that side, Genevieve.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, especially to the members of the diplomatic corps and students, politicians, members of the South African Communist Party and other political organizations and NGOs, and especially also the Muslim Students Association. I'd like to keep it short.
Could you hold the mic a little closer to you and speak up a little bit? Minister can't hear you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'd like to keep it short. I'm a bit of a silent speaker, but the Israeli issue is something I've been researching on for the past couple of years. And personally speaking, I feel that Western involvement is so rife that if we do not really clamp it down, because the West kind of influences these countries or these nations for strategic purposes, as Minister Kasrils said, by obviously ensuring that the arms industry is being supported, being a major source of their economic development at the expense of millions of lives in the world. So I came up with two questions. Firstly, in the events happening currently in Eastern Europe at the moment, do you think that this might affect what's happening in Palestine at the moment, in the sense that the influence or the focus will shift from Israel in terms of arms procurement to Ukraine, to obviously, you know, quote unquote, defeat the Russians and fight against the Russians? And then secondly, I also came up with this question. If the situation in Palestine develops in such a way that the Israeli government will be willing to negotiate a peaceful settlement in good faith, not these games that they've been playing over the years, how should South Africa intervene with regards to assisting Palestine draft a constitutional framework for either a one-state solution or a two-state solution with extensive arms reductions for the other side? Thank you.
Thank you. Respond to the questions that have been posed. We'll start with Saleh and then move on along the way.
How are we going to do this? I address all three questions and each of us address all three, or because I don't think I. All right, let me try.
Try.
On the issue of colonialism and the ICJ, that is indeed, I mean, valid. You make, in my personal opinion, make a very valid point, and it is really important to look at the, you know, as deep of the roots as possible. And apartheid is a crime. It was codified in 1973, so it was codified much later after it was coined and described and understood as that system of domination by one racial group over another. And so the codification in law came also much later, and this is what Amnesty deals with. It deals with how it is defined as a crime, how it is there in international law, and how it exists today in Israel and Palestine. What Amnesty is more concerned about, I mean, I think an advisory opinion by the ICJ is important, but what we're more concerned about is then actual accountability and the persecution of Israel and Israeli crimes at the International Criminal Court, and through the use of, for example, universal jurisdiction in countries that have opened their judicial system to be able to prosecute crimes against humanity and war crimes. So we have an opportunity at the ICC. There's an open investigation. We're calling on the Office of the Prosecutor to include an investigation into the crime of apartheid. There is also a commission of inquiry opened by the UN Human Rights Council, and we're also asking, in their mandate, they said they will be investigating root causes, and so I'll be interested how far they take it. But we also believe one of the root causes, or what makes up a large part of the root causes, is this system of oppression and domination amounting to apartheid, and therefore the Commission of Inquiry should investigate it. This is, at least from the point of view of Amnesty as a legal human rights organization, we're concerned with, and perhaps I can leave like more to colleagues here. In terms of how this document can help activists and whether it will end up as many other documents on a shelf with the status quo continuing or a human rights crisis perpetuating. You know, I have to say that's indeed a risk. And you know, there's been a lot that has been written, especially within the academia. And I'm here. I mean, your question is reminding me of Professor Laurie Allen in the UK, who wrote about how this massive regime of UN resolutions, investigative committees, human rights reports have been built around Palestine, right, with nothing happening. Actually, the human rights crisis has just continued to perpetuate. We like to believe, and I think this belief and hope is very important, that for a very long time, and this is what I was trying to do with my intervention, for a very long time we were dealing with symptoms, right? That we go and do this research, investigate, report on a pattern of unlawful killings here when, you know, Gazans are protesting. And then you have a spike of administrative detention there. Then a spike in, for example, home demolitions in Al-Naqab. Then you have land confiscations, the expansion of settlements, the building of settlement infrastructure. And it's always like these different things that are happening. And I think for the first time, and not only Amnesty, the body, like what we were mentioning, the group of human rights organizations are connecting the dots and saying there is something structural here. It is about the system. And these are all symptoms of this system. And let's deal with it as such. And this system cannot be reformed. It cannot be appeased. It has to be brought down. This consensus, I think, is important, and it is pointing to a turning point. There was an op-ed by the founder of one of the founders of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction movement, Omar Barghouti, along with the founder of Jewish Voice for Peace in the US, asking whether, after Amnesty's report, whether this is Palestine's South Africa moment, meaning that from here on, there is going to be a clear line drawn in history, and people will stand either on the wrong side of history, like it happened actually in South Africa, or on the right side of history, meaning, you know, we'll be taking that position and we'll be taking the action to bring the system down. This is a hope. I think it's important, and with then, you know, your efforts, your activism, and the acts of all people who care about rights and justice around the world, I think we will be able to see a dismantling of this system in our lifetime. Western involvement, Europe, I'm not sure I'm in a place. I mean, I'm still figuring out what's happening anyways, and the effects, but there are many analyses that are online now. I haven't been able to follow much on how much it affects. It will indeed affect. I mean, like anything now in this kind of globalized world, that when you have a major military operation or war or whatever, that will have ramifications on especially perhaps the Middle East, you know, that is ravaged by war. In terms of peace agreement and South Africa involvement, as Amnesty, we don't get into prescribe what is the outcome of this. Like if you see in the report, we don't talk about any political solution, but what we say that any solution, any way forward, must center international law and human rights. And without that, and this is perhaps, you know, and Zane has pointed to this because South Africa is taking that path. Without that, we'll just see the human rights violations, the patterns of crimes only perpetuate. They may die down a little bit with, for example, some negotiations, but they will come back without addressing the root causes, the system, centering human rights and international law. We'll just see the same kind of repeat itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Saleh. Zane, if you could respond to the relevant questions to you.
I'll deal just a bit more with the question where Saleh has just ended off, and the most appropriate person to talk about the conflicts in Eastern Europe would be Comrade Ronnie Kasrils. You know, we had a discussion with Saleh the other day about what does this document and the other documents mean in terms of strategy. And we sort of come to the conclusion, it means that we need to move away from the small distractions, dealing with small issues on the side, and actually come to a conclusion that what is required is dismantling of apartheid, which is a systemic and widespread system that affects Palestinians on, you know, throughout historical Palestine, on both sides of the Green Line, including the refugees. And that this system is prohibited by law, international law, and national laws. So South Africa's own constitution prohibits racism, for example. And that prohibition of racism doesn't end, if a public servant doesn't end when at the border. our Constitution enjoins us to ensure that we respect those norms even in the international arena, and to raise our voices when that kind of system is being implemented. So what it does is what these documents does, the Amnesty document, the Human Rights Watch document, the B'Tselem document, and it actually also brings to alive again the documents of Ilan Pape and others, and Yuri Davids and others, because what it shows us is that it's not a conflict. It's not a symmetrical conflict about two parties who can't agree on what needs to be done. It's an occupation and the systemic oppression governed by an illegal act of apartheid in international law. So the idea that all we need to do is go back to the Middle East peace process, get people around the table to discuss how the one party would stop practicing apartheid and the other party would negotiate itself out of oppression is perhaps no longer where the focus should be. The focus should be that there's a duty among states not to abide by illegal actions. And this is where the dismantling of apartheid shouldn't just be left to civil society activists. Dismantling of apartheid also then enjoins states through our own duties under international law to do certain things, whether it's an arms embargo that we're looking for, whether there's, you find comprehensive anti-apartheid acts that emerged in places like the US and other places, governed by the fact that there are duties under international law. I mean, as a young activist in 1986, I was part of a delegation that took a document called the Kairos document, and we had to go use that document to persuade the world to isolate apartheid South Africa. We are at that moment. We are at that moment in the situation on the occupation of Palestine, where there's enough evidence now that will persuade people that this notion that this is a symmetrical conflict with people who just need to get around the table to discuss is perhaps gone, that there's different strategies that need to be deployed, and the international community and nation states have particular duties under international law to act differently. And I think that's the big difference as to why this shouldn't be on the shelf. So there will be a momentum from the Human Rights Council in March, moving to the General Assembly in September, where using the same kind of tactics that was used against the apartheid South Africa. For example, I think it was 1973, Ashraf, if I'm not wrong, where South Africa was suspended from the General Assembly. Yeah. So, and that wasn't done willy-nilly. It was done by the then president of the General Assembly saying that this country has been found to be in contravention of international law. And they were suspended for that session. And that led to a whole range of other actions against a state found to be contravening important norms in the international community. And this is where the importance of these documents are. And it's up to us as the activists in the rooms here, representatives of the state, when we engage in the international community, to move away from nebulous politics, where different interests sometimes shift, to actually looking at this as a system that is widespread, and I'm going to repeat, systemic. It's prohibiting important international laws and norms, and we have duties. It moves from a want to do to a must do. And it shifts the dynamics when we engage in the international level. So I think that's the difference between what has been the case before, and the importance of these documents is that they're documenting things that are happening now. So the Amnesty report, the B'Tselem report, isn't just talking about things that happened at the Nakba 1947 or 48. They trace that for historical purposes. But the crime of apartheid and the system of apartheid is being perpetrated now as we speak. And that's the important point about what we focus on. So law isn't retroactive. So we'll have to focus on retrospective. But we'll have to focus on what we can do now. And these reports are really good in that they give us the guidance on what we should be doing.
Minister, if you have a small intervention.
Thank you very much. So the third question over there was speculating whether the situation in Eastern Europe, and obviously that refers to the current crisis in the Ukraine, whether in fact we would see the shipment of arms moving from Israel to Ukraine. And I take it that the question was referring to the incredible amount of USA-provided weapons, which goes into the billions every year in provision to Israel. Listen, the arms industry, in the first place, of the United States of America and other arms industries, including that of Israel, which has become very prominent and developed. These guys are laughing all the way to the bank. They're rubbing their hands with glee because they are ready to provide more and more weaponry for all the aggression that takes place, usually by states like Israel. Just think of the attacks on Gaza. Think of the attacks on the neighborhood, the threats against Iran. But they've attacked Jordan, they've attacked Egypt, they've attacked Syria and Lebanon. In the past, they attacked their neighbors. And they demonstrate to the world on Gaza how they can provide better and better weapons. But of course, the great arms producer is the United States of America. There's United Kingdom, there's France and others. They're loving this moment. So it's not a question of them not having sufficient weaponry for the fortress state of Zionist Israel. They've got plenty and they'll produce plenty more. And they've been providing those East European states bordering on Russia with such weaponry. You see, the question is a really good one. It links with the question from the lady on the right in the pink or the reddish dress, who reminds us very pertinently about colonial history and says, well, apartheid, which starts in 1948, the same month, in May, the very same month, when the apartheid regime was elected by the white-only electorate of South Africa, to the time when the Zionist state was established, the very same month of May 1948. But both go back. They actually go back much earlier than 1910 in South Africa. And I think that the lady was implying the whole gruesome history of colonial conquest and dispossession of the black people's land in South Africa, which goes back 3 centuries. With Palestine, of course, it really goes back. Ottoman period, which was very benign compared to what came after with the British Mandate. But of course it goes back to that original crime of the Balfour Declaration and of Churchill and their view of Israel. Because as Theodor Herzl, the proponent and the father of Zionism, already was stating in the late part of the 19th century at Zionist conferences in Europe, he was saying to the colonial powers of Europe, support us, recognize us, help us to establish a Jewish state, because, in his words, we Jews, and he's referring to Zionists, not all Jews were supporting him. Then or now, it's not anti-Semitism that we preach. He was saying we Zionists will build a wall against Asian barbarism, colonial motivation and attraction for the colonial powers. And Churchill jumped to it. And Balfour, they were anti-Semites. Let's get rid of the Jews from Britain. Let them go and be of use to us and its Zionists in Palestine, because they will collude with us and they will help us to control the Far East, India, the Suez Canal. They will become our gendarme, which in fact is what happened. And in fact, the United States has inherited that. And what is the United States and NATO up to in relation to the Ukraine, in relation to Eastern Europe? What is NATO, who should have closed down when the Warsaw Pact closed down? What is it existing for? And from that time, it has encroached 800 miles east to the borders of Russia, which suffered and lost 27 million people in the Second World War against the Nazi blitzkrieg. So quite frankly, who is going to think that the Russians, that their leader, whoever it might be, Putin or whoever, don't equate Russia, Putin and Russia, it's more than Putin. Who is going to think that the Russian people will just ignore the fact that NATO is building up forces and bases and weaponry that we've referred to, that they provide to Israel for the same purpose, to control resources going eastward, which is why there's the clamor and the warmongering in the West about the role of China and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We'll take a second round of questions and interventions. There's many, and we do have short of time, so I'm going to take 4 this time. Please keep it short, direct who you would like to answer your questions, and introduce yourself of where you're from. Ambassador and the diplomat next to you, whom I don't recognize. Ambassador Tariq Al-Ansari in front. I don't think that's operational, so we'll take the roving mic, please.
Thanks for Pretoria University and its Mediation Center to host us, and thanks for the panelists. And I appreciate so much Minister Kasrils' statements, and sir, you are very resourceful, and thank you very much for feeling for the Palestinians and for this crisis. I appreciate also so much His Excellency Mr. Zane Dangor, his very good analysis and the position of his country, South Africa, which is, of course, aligned with the position of Qatar in supporting the Palestinian people. And Mr. Saleh of Amnesty International, thank you very much for your statements and for presenting this report. I'm not going to go, of course, through the whole thing, but the document speaks for itself. As we say in the Middle East, the book speaks by its title, and the title speaks for the content of the report, which is Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, cruel system of domination and crime against humanity. But I have 2 questions, if you can please enlighten us and elaborate on something here. In page 6, for example, when you talk about the apartheid and international law, and precisely in the 4th paragraph, there is a sentence saying that this report or the Amnesty International does not intend to argue or assess the situation in the occupied Palestine territory with what happened, or the apartheid in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. Can you please tell us why did Amnesty choose this wording exactly, and what's the purpose? And then go into the section of the recommendations. Yeah, it's in page 6. Page 6, the 4th paragraph in the apartheid and international law section. There is a wording that says that this report or Amnesty does not want to compare the situation in the occupied Palestine with South Africa between 1950. That Amnesty is recommending to seek new approaches to deal with this question. So please, can you tell us what are these new approaches and who will do what exactly, and what international bodies will be related. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. To the diplomat sitting next to you, thank you. If you can please introduce yourself and direct your question to a member of the panel.
Yes, the good news that the diplomat sitting next to him is the ambassador of Egypt, so thank you. Perhaps it's because of COVID, and I'm glad that we're here for the first time resuming activities in town, and thank you for the invitation. I've listened attentively to the panelists, of course, and I thank you for your interventions. I've got maybe a couple of comments and a question. First of all, I'd like to draw the attention of the audience here that there already have been reactions from the Arab world and other places to this report. To my knowledge right now, even the League of Arab States and the Organization of Islamic States have both welcomed the report and issued statements in this regard, and have acknowledged the importance of that report as an important legal document. Now, looking into the report itself, I recognize that the notion of trying to not simply just document the litany of actions here or there, but to put it within a context of a particular legal framework that could have added value in future action. And with this in mind, I also recognize that the report stated that there was research and analysis carried out by Amnesty International in the course of the work between July 2017 and November 2021. And in this context, I was a bit surprised that there's no mentioning there of the new Jewish nation-state law in the report. Now, if you're talking about legalities, I mean, this is an important development that took place in 2018. And we in Egypt, as a government, I mean, we've rejected that law as one that is consolidating the notion of occupation and racial segregation. So I would have thought that this would be an important element in that report, given that you're covering that particular period and you're having a legal angle to that. So perhaps you may have an explanation as to why that has not been there. Now, on the politics of the subject matter, of course, I've recognized what has been said about the need to take further action, and that would entail some sort of coordination, of course. The good news, I mean, in Egypt and perhaps in the Arab world, we are Semitic, so we cannot be anti-Semitic. Huh? So, I mean, we are free from, I mean, we are not intimidated by any talk in that respect when we speak our voice and so forth. It's not a secret that Egypt has already a peace treaty with Israel, of course, so within the context of settling a number of wars that have gone through. But it is also not a secret that the government of Israel has always been complaining that peace relations have been frosty between both peoples. And this, there's a reason for that. It's not simply the wars that have been ongoing there, but also for these incidents and actions that have been documented, not just by Amnesty International, but have been ongoing throughout, that have created a considerable degree of discomfort amongst the Egyptian population and made them resent going into a warm relation with Israel. I finally would like to draw your attention to a reason also. There has been a poll that's been taken back several years ago in Egypt as to what is the single most domestic issue that is of concern to the Egyptian public. And first and foremost amongst that was the Palestinian issue. So in the sense that for Egyptians to understand that this issue is not simply something that's outside our territory, that we're not, has nothing to do with us. That's not the case. It is the single most domestic issue according to those polls within the Egyptian public. And that further explains why there is that kind of a frosty relation. And clearly this report doesn't add, is not going to change that, is not going to reverse that frostiness. Apparently that's going to make it even more difficult. So we look forward to working with other countries in improving the livelihood of the Palestinians. Everybody is also aware that we have helped broker the ceasefire in Gaza back last year, and this was detrimental in trying to reduce the damage as much as possible until this action that would emanate from such a report would kick off and help improve their livelihood from a different angle. So it's not just simply about the basic regular human rights action, but also the immediate security. I mean, when there's a lot of violence, I mean, this is something also that needs to take action, and we have an eye on both such actions and others that would take a longer time to materialize into something more concrete. Thank you.
Take the lady at the back, and then Quraisha on this side, and then we'll allow the panel to respond, and then one last round, simply because I want to hear from the students. Also, Your Excellency, perhaps you're aware that a few days ago, South Africa's Constitutional Court made a very important decision distinguishing the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I think this is really a precedent that has been set for our country and for other countries as well. Please introduce yourself and direct your question to the panelist you would like to have answer.
Good afternoon. I'm Asma Sidat. I'm here today representing MSA Tax and the Palestine Solidarity Committee, which has recently been re-established at the University of Pretoria. From my brief review of the report, I noticed that there is not much mention of Zionism. If I'm not mistaken, there is no mention of Zionism at all. Obviously, Zionism being the nationalistic political ideology that initially called for the creation of a Jewish state and now supports the continued existence of Israel as such a state. My question to Mr. Saleh is there a reason for this omission in the report? And also, is it possible...
Sorry to interrupt you. Could you remove your mask? It's very difficult for the minister to hear you. Thank you so much.
I'll just repeat what I said. But my question was that from my brief review of the report, I noticed that there was not much mention or no mention at all of Zionism. And my question for Mr. Saleh is there a reason for this omission in the report? And is it really possible to end Israel's apartheid without ending the Zionist settler colonial project? Thank you.
Thank you so much. While the mic is making its way to Quraisha, I'm going to ask Saleh to begin responding, and then we'll come to Quraisha and to the other questions.
Thank you. I'll start with the excellencies here. To the Excellency Ambassador of Qatar, correct? With regards to the paragraph you mentioned, basically the intention behind the paragraph is to say that apartheid is defined under international law as a crime. It is not, this report or apartheid is not unique only to the South African context and what happened between 1948 and 1994. And this report is not a comparison between the situation of South Africa and then the situation in Israel and Palestine. The definition of apartheid under international law in both the Convention and the Rome Statute is global. Amnesty International put out a report in 2017 making a case that Myanmar is perpetrating the crime against humanity of apartheid against the Rohingya Muslims in the Rakhine state. That was also not a comparison to the situation in South Africa, and there's also not a comparison with the situation in Palestine currently. So that is basically the purpose behind this. And what I want to say is that the document between your hands is only the executive summary of the report. The report is 280 pages, and it goes into full details about the nation-state law as a law ambassador, Excellency, as the law basically crowning a body of laws that are discriminatory and racist against Palestinians. there's an extensive analysis of the law, the nation-state law, and how it has been applied also recently. And so you can find that in the full report. Sorry, I'm jumping between the two, but I'm going to go back to how far will we go into implementing the recommendations. Amnesty International is a movement of 10 million members around the world. We will be mobilizing these 10 million members to put pressure on their states, on other states, on the United Nations and its bodies, on their parliaments, on international organizations, to first recognize the situation for what it is, apartheid. And here I have a question to your excellencies about that recognition on behalf of your states when it comes to the situation as apartheid, and also pivot that recognition then into action. And we have a bunch of recommendations in there, including, for example, when it comes to states, to immediately suspend the direct and indirect supply of sale or transfer, including transit and transshipment to Israel of all weapons, munitions, and other military and security equipment, including the provision of training and other military and security assistance. We're also asking all states to institute and enforce a ban on products from Israeli settlements in your markets and regulate companies domiciled in your jurisdiction in a manner to prohibit companies operating in the settlements and trade in settlement goods. Overall, we're asking to all states to use all political and diplomatic tools at your disposal to ensure Israeli authorities implement the recommendations outlined in this report, ensure that human rights are central to all bilateral and multilateral agreements with the Israeli authorities, including by exercising due diligence to ensure that these do not contribute to maintaining the system of apartheid. This is what we will be pushing for, and we will be pushing for that quite hard. We're right now focused on the recognition. Alongside the report, we have also put out a human rights education course online, available to anybody with internet access in multiple languages. One last thing, perhaps, to the Excellency Ambassador of Egypt is that, of course, all efforts to improve the livelihoods of Palestinians is always very welcome. But what the report is doing here, and what we've been trying, the point that we've been trying to hone down, is that there is structural oppression and domination. And that structural oppression and domination must be uprooted, must be completely brought down. And this is what we hope us, other organizations, also with other partners, member states who are advocating for human rights, is to push for that, is to move from dealing with the symptoms and giving the bit of aid whenever you have a crisis to really tackling the root causes. This is where civil society has gone and is already there. This is where we believe the UN system is going to be going. Israeli officials since the beginning of the year have been warning about the Commission of Inquiry that is set up by the Human Rights Council to look into root causes. They've identified that as a strategic threat. And the reason for this is because the Commission of Inquiry has put in its mandate that it will look at root causes. We'll be trying to persuade the Commission of Inquiry that apartheid is one of the root causes. But this is also where the UN system is going. We have a commission that is evergreen in its mandate. It also includes Israel and not only the occupied Palestinian territories in its investigative mandate, and it also in it has a mechanism that can transfer evidence it collects to the International Criminal Court. This is very important. It is going to the root causes, and we hope also member states, nation states, also support this. On the question of Zionism, a very important question, but it's not in the mandate of Amnesty International. Amnesty International does not comment on political ideology. It did not do that on Zionism. It's not going to do that on Daesh or anybody else. What we are concerned with are human rights violations. We are a human rights organization. We tackle human rights violation according to international law. What we are saying here is that there is a system of oppression and domination, a grave human rights violation amounting to apartheid being perpetrated by Israel, which also amounts to a crime against humanity. We're calling on this to end. We're calling for accountability to those who are perpetrating it. And we're calling on all those who have, well, all those who have the moral and legal responsibility, and this is everybody around the world, to take action against this. So this is what Amnesty and this report is concerned about. But Your question is very relevant, and there are other people who may be commenting, one, on settler colonialism, like we were talking about, Zionism and other issues.
Thank you very much, Saleh. I don't think there were any questions directed to the other panelists. Qureisha?
Thank you very much to the panel, and we really welcome everybody who's attended this on behalf of the CMA and AMAC and Amnesty. Saleh, my question is to you. Germany is one of Israel's staunchest supporters and has pursued a special relationship with the country as well as with pro-Israeli Jewish groups in Germany. Germany's foreign ministry has said it rejects the term apartheid, adding that it does not help solve the Middle East conflict, and in my opinion, that's laughable. It's almost an insult to our intelligence. Now, Amnesty International Germany published the report on its website, but noted that in the current climate and historical context, an objective, factual debate on the report is difficult to achieve, and said it would not organize any activities around the publication to deter misinterpretation of the report. A few days later, the report was no longer prominent on the Germany Amnesty website, yet it was, the top report of Amnesty International. Considering this and what Mr. Kasrils said right at the start, we should not be surprised at the lack of European presence here today. Is Amnesty really independent of any government or political ideology? Because how is it that Amnesty Germany clearly contradicts this vision? And my question, therefore, to you is, should Amnesty Germany then be allowed to exist?
May I add to Qureisha's question, Saleh, but you can respond to it later.
You should exist. I mean, just to put it there, and I'll come to the answer of the question, yes.
The executive director of Amnesty International in Tel Aviv has also come out almost against the report, criticizing it and taking a very different position to Amnesty International worldwide. How is that going to affect the dynamics of the implementation of this report? But I'm going to take a few more questions before you do those answers. So, 3 in a row there. Let's take all of those, and then Bassam. Are there any others? Because I'm going to be closing after this round of questions. At the back, there's one hand there, and so you've already had a chance to speak, so the lady in front. That's it. So 3 here is the representative of Palestine, and one right at the back, and the lady here. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ander Illes. I work in law and land reform. Just about something you said earlier, Zeenat, about the biometric system. So my colleague at WITS, Keith Breckenridge, remarked at a conference that UP's biometric system, which comes from a French manufacturer, was also developed in Israel. But that's an aside. About the status of Israeli apartheid and how to change the situation in Israel, I wanted to ask Ronnie and Zane about how apartheid ended in South Africa. Because yes, there was international pressure, but a significant factor in ending apartheid in South Africa was the split between the political and economic elites in South Africa itself. So significant domestic pressure that came about. So you talk about jus cogens and the obligations that result then on other states, but the reality is that apartheid, the suppression and punishment of apartheid convention is from 1973. Apartheid ended in 1994, so it took a very long time for a very strong jus cogens principle to get there. And there are other jus cogens accepted violations in Israel, like the occupation of the West Bank, which is illegal under the Geneva Convention 4. That's also a jus cogens principle. The fact that there are obligations on external states might not be the determining factor. So what do you think can happen in Israel in pushing for a local movement, a local force to dismantle Israeli apartheid?
Thank you, Zeenat. Noor Ahmed, I'm the coordinator for the Palestine Solidarity Alliance, also involved with the South African BDS Coalition. My question is for Mr. Dangor from DIRCO. During your inputs, you mentioned that there is a duty among states not to abide by the illegal actions, and you also touched on how South Africa was expelled by the General Assembly. But then we saw on the 26th of January, the office of Durko actually tweeted out about, and I quote, South Africa has maintained diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. And they also spoke about how South Africa is in favor of a two-state solution. And so my question essentially is that there seems to be two very varying or different things that are being said. So how does the South African government plan on staying true to their promise of solidarity with the Palestinian people when we have seen such sort of contradictory statements from Durko? And also, how is the South African government going to ensure that the stance that they take is actually what Palestinians on the ground want? Because obviously Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, and a two-state solution wasn't something that was accepted when it came to South Africa. So obviously we can't expect Palestinians to be okay with it. So that's my question to you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good afternoon. My name is Fasiha David. I'm a student at the University of Pretoria. I am a Muslim, but most of all, I'm a human being. And I would take that this is why we gathered today, because this is a humanitarian issue, as pointed out earlier. Just to comment on what one of the members of MSA said, speaking about, putting in the form that the ideology of Zionism, and the honorable member or excellency commented, that Amnesty doesn't do that. I just wanted to point out, I find that, a bit challenging to understand, because if it is a humanitarian organization and Zionism is anti-humanity, then that should be spelled out. That's the one thing. Another thing is, for the document we're presenting to the ICJ, is there a process or some way that youth can be involved to hasten up that process? I just feel like 60 years of oppression is long enough for things to go to the ICJ. And then also, just to comment that Islam is a religion of peace. And, like Martin Luther King said, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it is the presence of justice. And so in seeking justice from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it's quite ironic, how inadequate they have been in assisting Palestine. How can we hasten that process? Also, I have another question. Is our political correctness hindering justice for Palestine? And when will the time come when we can put our political correctness aside in order to actually help Palestine? And also, there's been a lot of references to the past in history and structural imperialism and mentions of apartheid in South Africa. And then, that comparison to Palestine. But then the question is, how do we make it relevant? How do we use that ideologies and actually make it relevant to the present time we're living in? Like BDS, besides the boycotting and the sanctions, what else can we do as youth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Genevieve, if we can get the mic to the front, please, to Mr. Bassam.
Thank you. My name is Bassam Al-Husseini, counselor at the Embassy of Palestine. Firstly, thank you for Department of International Relations and Cooperation and EMEC, as well as Amnesty and the university for organizing this important event. I would like, on behalf of our ambassador, to extend our appreciation for Amnesty to issuing this important report, especially after facing a challenge from USA and Israel. As well as want to extend our appreciation on behalf of our people and the Palestinian leadership for South Africa after the issuing, especially the important ruling from Constitution Court about Zionism and the position at African Union. My question for Mr. Hijazi, as you know, you are from Jerusalem and your wife from Ramallah, and the distance between Jerusalem and Ramallah may be less than 10 kilos. Just tell us about your daily life, how you move from Ramallah, where you stay, how your wife can go to visit your family in Ramallah, and as wife and husband, when you travel from Palestine to abroad, how you travel. Thank you.
Mr. Bassam, we have a question right at the back, Genevieve, and then the lady in front. While the mic is moving, let's do some answers. Please go ahead, Saleh.
I'm just anxious to answer the Germany one, and AI Israel. Look, as Amnesty does everywhere, we produced a report that is based on scientific research, rigid legal analysis. This report has gone much further in terms of both size and analysis than any other report that Amnesty has put out. I think we broke the record in terms of footnotes, for example. I believe it's around 1,500. We follow, as an organization, a very rigorous, what we call quality assurance research methodology that we apply equally across the board. Now, we're also a human rights movement. I said it's 10 million members around the world. It's sections in many countries around the world. Not every report is going to be received the same by everybody. This report in particular may shock some people, and it has, may upset some people, and it has. Some people may oppose it, some people may find it inconvenient, yeah? But that will not change anything about the report and what we're going to do about it. It is right that you have some opposing, and Amnesty Germany has actually pulled its statement about the report that it attached. So obviously there are things that happen also internally to correct the path. But it is really up to them as well. It is a democratic movement. What they choose to do or not to do is up to a section, similar to South Africa, for example. That doesn't change anything about the report, and it doesn't change anything about then the tens of other sections and hundreds of thousands of members who are currently, and it hasn't been a month since the publication of the report, mobilized to take action to dismantle Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. So this is it in brief. Amnesty Germany should definitely exist and continue to work, and we hope it does take a more proactive stand when it comes to violations and especially crimes against humanity by Israel against Palestinians. There was another question to me, and I think the other two, so I'll do that. Mr. Bassam. Thanks for the question, because it brings us back to the stories. So I am a citizen of Israel. My partner, my wife, is Palestinian from the West Bank. We hold different legal statuses. We are different in terms of identity cards. And Israel divides Palestinians into 5 categories. There are those who are citizens, like myself, never equal to Jewish Israelis, because I'm not a national. I'm not Jewish, I'm Palestinian. Then you have Palestinian residents of Israel, like those living in East Jerusalem. My dad is one. Then you have Palestinians in the West Bank, and I'm giving you the list in hierarchy in terms of what rights and restrictions are imposed. So Palestinian citizens, less restrictions. Palestinian residents of Israel, more restrictions. Palestinians of the occupied West Bank, more restrictions than the other two. And then you have Palestinians who are in Gaza, much less. And then you have Palestinians with no legal status at all living in the West Bank or in Israel or in East Jerusalem. And those live basically underground with the fear of being deported, including out of the country at any point. And in the report, there is a case of a journalist called Mustafa Al-Kharov, which I encourage everybody to look at, because he is still under imminent threat of forcible deportation outside of the country, and we're campaigning on his case. So this is the hierarchy of Palestinians. Gazans are controlled in Gaza, not allowed because of a collective punishment and an illegal blockade to just basically remain there. Palestinians of the West Bank, like my wife, she has to first of all, according to law, which I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, I'm not able to pass my legal status to her. So she's never able to become an Israeli citizen like myself. So for her to travel around, she will need to apply for a permit. And to apply for a permit, you need to go to the Israeli military and most probably and most often be interrogated by the Israel Security Agency. This is called the Shabak or the Shin Bet, in circumstances that, to say the least, are humiliating, degrading, and very dangerous to Palestinians. Dangerous because there can be blackmail and there could be violence, including the use of ill treatment and torture during these interrogations for a simple matter of getting a permit, for example, to visit the family. So we don't do that, to be honest. We don't ask for permit, and therefore, my wife is not able to travel with me when I go and visit my grandmother in Jerusalem or my mother in Jerusalem. When we travel abroad, if we travel abroad, she's not able to travel with me through the airport. She goes through Jordan. There's no Palestinian airport, of course. There's no ports connecting Palestine to the outside world. It's always through Israel, and for Palestinians in the West Bank, it's through Israel and then Jordan. And to do that, you'll need also a permit from the Israeli military to leave the West Bank. This is according to the military. Palestinians of the West Bank are subject to military orders, a body of military laws issued by military commanders, and that controls every single little bit of life, daily life, including where you go, where you live, how you live, and how you leave the West Bank. So when we do travel, we travel through different routes. You go through Jordan, I go through the airport. We have two sons, and because they were born to an Israeli citizen, then they get Israeli citizenship. They're not registered under their mother's ID card, which, by the way, is also issued by Israel. So all of these, although they are Palestinian, so Israel controls also the population registry of the occupied Palestinian territories. So any ID card has to be okayed, although there is the Palestinian Authority, it has to be issued and okayed by the Israeli authorities. This is why you have undocumented, basically Palestinians living in the West Bank. It's because Israel refuses to have any new entries into this population registry, and therefore you have many families who are living underground, many families who, particularly women who came from outside, married Palestinian men in the West Bank, and are stuck in the West Bank, living underground, because they cannot cross checkpoints for fear of being caught and then deported outside of the country, being separated from their families. But these women have also not been able to see their parents, for example, who are in Jordan, in Syria, in the US, in Europe, whatever it is, for many years. And we have in the report also many of the stories of these, mainly women, some who have not seen their families outside of Palestine for more than 30 years, for example. Yeah.
May ask you to allow the other two questions.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted
No,
to,
it's fine. And then we're going to be coming to the other panelists to respond.
I hope it got across, so I'm
sure
satisfied.
it would
Yeah,
have.
thank you.
We're just running out of time, and that's the reason why I want to be a little bit concise. So I'm going to allow the other two questions, and then we'll have the panel respond and do their final concluding remarks. So the lady at the back, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nasia Juma, and I'm the chairperson of the Palestinian Solidarity Committee of the University of Pretoria for 2022. My question is directed to Zane. It was just mentioned earlier about the dismantling of an apartheid system and how mostly states can help this happen because civil society struggles to do that on their own. My question is just, how do you propose that states go about this, considering that all states have different views and different foreign policies? It's very difficult to get states on the same page. And then to touch bases on what my fellow comrade said about colonialism from the British state, the state of America is very, very powerful. So how do you go about that when such a powerful state has such control over Israel? How do you propose that these states show their dominance against the United States of America by coming together, considering the power that the USA holds, I know this question, the answer to this question probably is very deep, but just to touch bases on that, because I feel like there's a lack of accountability by all of these foreign states, especially the United States of America, when it comes to the crimes and humanitarian crimes that they have allowed Israel to enforce. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question will be coming from the lady on this side.
Good day, everyone. I am Kangisile Mlambo. I am a postgrad student at the University of Pretoria, and I am also a tutor under the politics department, and I work for an organization that is currently based in Mauritius, but has links all over the world, called the Advanced Study of African Renaissance Ideas. And what this organization is basically centered around is the belief that Africa, the Middle East, and Asian countries in the 21st century are now equal players in world politics and not secondary to the West, right? So my question is that we talk about supporting Palestine as citizens of South Africa and all these other countries, but how exactly do we do that? Because one trend that I have noticed is that each and every time when there is a tragedy in Palestine, the world stands up and social media goes into a frenzy and everybody speaks as to how terrible the actions of Israel are, and then within a week, that momentum is lost and we're back at square one and we're waiting for the next tragedy. So how do we properly support Palestine, and how do we make substantive change? So anyone in the panel is actually welcome to answer this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will now ask the panelists to respond to questions that have yet been unanswered, but also to include your concluding remarks at the same time, and try to keep it as short and concise as possible given the time frame. If we may start with Zane on this side and then move over. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'll be short, and I might even ask the former ambassador, South Africa's ambassador to Palestine, to just come in very quickly. The question about, Fasiha asked it and a few others asked it as well. Is there a contradiction in what we're doing? The tweet by Dirko and the statement that we're making about a new trajectory. And it comes back to a question about what was the question, what's the tipping point? And thus far, you'll find that, and Saleh used those words, morality and politics. So there's been this sort of approach to, this is a moral issue, it's a political issue, and it hasn't found traction. And precisely because of the balance of forces that somebody spoke about, it hasn't found traction. But within the international community, there are certain norms, and you would understand, that people cannot move away from. The legal issue has never been a factor in the discussion around the occupation in Palestine. These reports is raising it to the point where we're finding that it's best now to tackle this from a legal angle and keeping people accountable to the norms in the international community as opposed to appealing to morality and politics. Because it might be very difficult for a country that, for example, argues that country X must be sanctioned immediately because of their breach of international law in terms of territorial sovereignty, and then the very next day ignore the fact that this has been happening for 75 years in the context of Palestine. So the legal issues then is something that this report and others will allow us to change the nature of the discourse, and the strategies will shift. So South Africa has been playing that role. The fact that we have diplomatic ties with Israel is something that we also, the cabinet is going to be engaging with the document very soon, where we're not just moving away from politics, we're actually saying, here is a set of legal arguments coming from B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, complementing work that's been done by the Cairo Institute, Al-Haq and others, what should we do as the South African state in terms of our domestic bilateral relations and the international space. Speaking to Palestinians, a two-state, one-state solution, we speak to all Palestinians, whether it's Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority, we speak to Palestinians in Gaza, in the diaspora, and there's varied views on this. And I think perhaps what we should be doing is, and this is the issue, is what do we focus on? We should be focusing on dismantling this apartheid state and the systemic nature of it, and find the best strategies to do that. I want Ambassador Suleiman, I'll be very formal with him, just to comment on what happened to him when we downgraded our mission in Tel Aviv. Some reflections on that, the engagements of Palestinians, but also some reflections of his time there on the issue of one state, two state. And then we'll hand over to Ronnie to conclude.
Thank you. I'm put into a little bit of a spot here, but it's okay. Firstly, allow me to thank the panel for this engaging discussion. And it is not the first time that we'll be talking about Palestine. I think there's lots that have happened. Yes, just to take Zane's last point first. When we withdrew our ambassador, they restricted my movement in Palestine. And I wasn't allowed to go to Gaza anymore. And I think to this day, none of us as diplomats that are based in Palestine are allowed to go to Gaza. Now, Bassam comes from Gaza and he knows the type of work that we had done there. And as Zane had correctly stated, that we wanted to find a way to engage Palestinians across the board in finding a solution to this conflict. That was just part of it. But we have lots of other restrictions that have been that have been imposed on us. And it's not about us as individuals. And that is why we need to just extricate ourselves. But what we face is nothing compared to what Palestinians face on a daily basis. Saleh had just spoken about, just as a family, how his movements to leave Palestine and go abroad. But Palestinians, Ramallah is what? You know, not even, Ramallah in all intents and purposes is part of East Jerusalem. And that is an accepted norm. And people in Ramallah cannot go to Jerusalem. You have to be, well, as he firstly correctly stated that you needed a permit. I can even talk about, in personal incidences, but we don't want to talk about people because our children, my son used to play football for a team in Jerusalem, and he had a diplomatic card, and to go to Ramallah to play football in the evening, he had to go to Kalandia, which is a checkpoint, and then he's exposed to somebody from the Defense Force who's got no idea about a diplomatic card. So they pull him out and then send the rest of the team across to Ramallah. Now, for him, he was new. It was in his first or second month being in Palestine. So he has to wait until he is cleared so that that young person, and probably also maybe South African, I don't know, but will then get permission for him to then leave, get another taxi, because, and then go and play the football match. And I don't know where it is. And that is this, but that is not comparable to what Palestinians have to face daily. That is why one of the things that we do is to just get ourselves out of it and try to see how we can resolve the conflict. But I was very, very keen on Zane's statement. We need to move from political solidarity to legal duty. And I think this group of people can put pressure on government, because that's where the support comes from. You put pressure on us as government, And we are then obliged to put pressure on whether it is the African Union, whether it is at the UN, or whoever we engage on the issue of Palestine. And that is the best way to get us to move ahead. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Suleiman. Minister Kasrils.
Thank you. I'll address myself to the really interesting question from the gentleman in the black mask. You can put up your hands to remind them of the question. Okay. So, in a sense, you directed us to the divide that took place in South Africa. It led to a reformist, beginning of a reformist change to the full democratic change in 1994. And it's a very interesting process that it's not the main contradiction in the struggle in this country, of course, which was primarily between white supremacy, representing the white population, and the black people of our country, African, Indian, and colored people, the primary. And the result of it was, of course, not through changes within white society between, as you correctly put it, between the political, economic elites. It's correct that, but that's secondary. It applies to whatever way we analyze and examine Israeli society and the wider situation of the Holy Land, which of course is the same. It's the contradiction between a settler colonial state, which you can refer to as Zionist, representing the Jewish people, not all who are Zionists, some aren't. But in a sense then, the Israeli supremacy on the one hand, Jewish Zionist supremacy over the Palestinians. And the resolution to that, as in South Africa, as elsewhere, as in Algeria, between the French settlers and the indigenous Algerian people, or Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia with their white populace, etc. The primary contradiction and therefore struggle is between an indigenous people struggling for their rights, national determination, rights, freedoms, etc., against a supremacist state representing a minority. Right. Of course, in this, whether we were examining or analyzing what happened in Algeria, in their struggle, there was a big split in terms of the French ruling class and the French settlers there, who together with right-wing forces of the French army wanted to fight to the death. And de Gaulle, who is representing the French bourgeoisie, decided that they would pull out and allow independence. But remember, that took place because of the incredible determination and struggle of the Algerian people. Examine any country in the world, any struggle of these kinds of national struggle. That's how the resolution takes place in the end. Now, coming to a comparison, and of course, Salah, the report, those of us of Palestine solidarity in this country and so on, we say it's apartheid as South Africa is, but we don't say it's absolutely identical. There are differences. The South African situation, they wanted to push the blacks away into Bantustans, secondary, third-class citizens, but needed black labor to make the economy work. The demographics in the former historic Palestine in Israel, Greater Israel, has been as a result of the influx, especially it's pre the 1945, not 1948 situation. But in 1948, after a huge influx of European Jews, later Oriental Jews from Arab countries, to boost the Jewish demographics. You know, in 1948, when the UN decided that Israel, that the Jews could have their separate state, their homeland as it was called then, the Jews only owned 6% of the land. And despite the influx of the Holocaust victims from Europe, etc., they were only 30% of the population. Since then, in the whole of the historic Palestine, it's about 50-50, 6 million v 6 million. But of course, they've pushed away those 6 million, the 5 million in the occupied territories, leaving about 1 million or so within what we call original Israel. The class structure in Israel requires a lot of study by all those who are looking at the process of change there. You don't find the split in the Jewish community that makes up Israel as similar to what happened in relation to English speakers and Afrikaans speakers in South Africa. Afrikaans speakers who, as we know from 1948, became the political rulers of the country. And at that time, you had the former, going way back to the 1910 settlement, etc., you had the English speakers, mainly of British descent, who had the control of the economy, and the big bourgeoisie, the Oppenheimers, etc., English barons who really controlled from the time of mining. By 48, that was still the case, and the Afrikaner nationalists basically represented a farming community, a rural community, white workers, Afrikaner who had come to the towns, who became a majority in number of the whites. And they were led by a petty bourgeoisie, Marxist term, but a small middle class aspiring to compete with the English-speaking economic elite. And they used the political power, I mean, you would well know this, to gradually boost their interests in the country. We see it in terms of, if we personalize, in the Rupert Empire and the other capitalists of Afrikanerdom who came to the fore and became part of an economic elite and a political elite. However, the differences that emerged here were based in those economics, so that the economic elite, now still in charge of the National Party, began to see that reform would benefit them, and they were encouraged by their allies in the West who feared that the black people would create a full-on revolution. And that's what led de Klerk, representing that class force, to seek the reform and get into talks. However, we must, and I'm not saying you are doing that, we must never think that the key element of the change in South Africa was that. That reformism was forced on them and their allies in the West by both international conditions, fall of the Soviet Union, etc., but especially internal. And that was the struggle of the people of South Africa. That's what broke the camel's back. It wasn't a last straw. And of course, the international solidarity empowered, inspired the people and isolated apartheid South Africa. That was the conundrum, that was the formula, and so on. So when we look at Israel, and it's really up to the Palestinians who know it so much better than us, to our ambassador and representatives there, Durko, to civil society, our research groups, but the Palestinians. And with you, people like Yuri Davis and Ilan Pape and the courageous Jewish academics and revolutionary academics, as with white intelligentsia in this country, including Afrikaners, who played something of a role in setting the narrative straight and helping to raise the clamor. Remember, and there's a similarity here, sorry to go on, I just want to end quickly, that in South Africa, an element of forcing the reform on the white side was that many white conscripts, Saleh, were refusing to serve in the army. And we see the parallel in Israel, Jewish society, where a significant number of young men and quite a number of very courageous Jewish women are actually going to jail, serving their 6-month sentences. Some go in for a third and a fourth time. I've seen this in the case of some of the 18, 20-year-old women who say they largely are very narrow, viciously racist fundamentalists in biblical terms, who are to the right even of Netanyahu, and certainly those who came before him, as Israeli society becomes, as a result of the ruling class and their propaganda machinery and so on, increasingly racist. So that has to be taken into account. I'd end by saying to our PSC and PSA solidarity activists, and all of us, including in foreign affairs, with people like Zane, with people like our representative there, who really represent us well and are pushing the envelope. But it's civil society here who really has that role to play in terms of influencing government, pressurizing government, taking up the issue of implementing and popularizing this, calling for a full BDS to be applied against Israel. We are regarded internationally as to the fore in this kind of struggle. And it's really, if South Africa takes very powerful steps, and if South Africa decided on sanctions, but on more than the arms sanction that is mentioned here, but the total boycott, divestment, and the sanctioning, the isolation of Zionist Israel will help Jewish people there, as we will really inspire and come to the assistance of our Palestinian sisters and brothers. Thank you.
Minister, yes, we would want Saleh to give his concluding remarks, but before he does, I want to recognize that you are an encyclopedia for us, and it's been so helpful to listen to you. Okay. So before we hand over to Saleh, I think I want to just recognize that one of the issues that South African civil society has been working on is the prosecution of IDF soldiers who have perpetrated crimes against humanity in Gaza in particular. There is what's called the Gaza docket, which has been tabled at the National Prosecuting Authority, identifying 73 dual citizens, so that is South African citizens who have served in the IDF. There's another docket that's being prepared with another 100 and something number that have been identified as well. We need to apply pressure on the National Prosecuting Authority to take that forward, and it has been tabled at the ICC as well. So from a legal perspective, South African civil society is certainly already ahead of the pack and already ahead of this report. And I think it just needs that extra impetus to be able to do that. But we also want to take the opportunity to emphasize that government needs to look into the idea of dual citizenship for Israelis and who are South African citizens. We need to change that regulation, and we need to apply pressure on our government to do that. Saleh, I would like to hand over to you for your concluding remarks. Thank you.
I think what Minister Kasrils and now what you were saying is the perfect ending to this. So, I just want to say thank you all for this. It was been really honor, and yes, much appreciated. Thank you.
I want to take the opportunity on behalf of the Afro-Middle East Centre to thank all of you for your attendance here. We wish we could have accommodated more people, but with COVID protocols, you can understand we were restricted. I want to express my deep, deep gratitude to Qureisha Suleiman and the CMA, Centre for Mediation in Africa, to University of Pretoria for accommodating us in this beautiful venue. I want to thank Amnesty International South Africa and Shanila Mohammed, the Executive Director, for making this possible. And I want to express my thanks to all of the technicians. I will not mention all of you by name. There are many of you. Thank you so much for your support. There are some snacks for everyone. And thank you to their excellencies for also gracing us with their presence here. There are snacks for people to have, and we hope to see you in future events like this one. It was really fruitful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Zane.